So at first glance, this seems to be a quaint little biblical love story in which the main characters of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, they just seem to do everything right. However, a look at the dynamics that lie behind the story reflect another dimension, which makes the friendship between Ruth and Naomi even more remarkable. The story begins with a family in crisis. Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their sons Mahlon and Chilion left their home in Bethlehem because of famine and moved to Moab, where there was food. But what was not mentioned in the text was the strife between the nations of Moab and Judah. A reference to Moab is a reminder that Moabites and Ammonites are part of Abraham's extended family, descended from the incestuous union of his cousin Lot and his daughters. Israel's disdain for these extended family members can be seen in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3, where the Ammonites and Moabites were excluded from the assembly for 10 generations. But there was a famine, and desperate times call for desperate measures. However, soon after the family arrived in Moab, Elimelech dies, and his sons marry Moabite women. Years later, the sons died as well, and Naomi was alone. In a culture where there is no social security or pension checks, and no other way for older women to support themselves, sons were the only source of economic stability. Her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, had also lost their husbands and their financial support, but they were young and they could remarry. But that was not the case for Naomi. In fact, Naomi hopes that Orpah and Ruth will get new husbands to marry and then provide them with some security. What we see in this text is the love and the affection and connection among these women. Orpah chooses to stay in Moab and salvage her life among her people, and Ruth chooses to become an immigrant. Many theologians like to pit Orpah and Ruth against each other and even denigrate Orpah in order to celebrate Ruth's choice. But the text does not cast Orpah in a negative light, for her choice, and interpreters should resist the temptation to pit women against each other, celebrating one at the expense of the other. The same is true for Hagar and Sarah, for Rachel and Leah, and for the sisters in the New Testament, Martha and Mary. The truth is, different women make different choices based on a variety of factors. To remain in one's own country with one's own family, as Orpah did, should not be considered less faithful. Orpah was following the advice of her mother-in-law, the elder and wiser woman. The book of Ruth teaches us about female bonding. Ruth and Naomi's relationship is a special friendship that can often develop between women despite differences in age, nationality, and religion. Ruth and Naomi's legacy is that of a seasoned friendship between two women, a friendship which survived the test of time despite the odds against women. In a patriarchal system such as ancient Israel's, widows were mostly at risk. They were valued for their childbearing ability to carry on the name of the male head of household by bearing sons. I believe that's why the Bible expresses so much concern for the well-being of widows and really none for widowers. Later on in the book, Ruth's future husband, Boaz, instructs the young men several times not to mistreat Ruth while she gleans. He orders them not to humiliate her and not to scold her. Boaz had to lay down the rules in order to protect Ruth, because the typical life of the immigrant who has to pick the leftovers is a harsh one. It was not safe for her and Naomi to be alone in the world, living in uncertainty, leaving one scary situation for another, both of them grieving their many, many losses. I'm reminded that people today may find themselves in a similar Ruth and Naomi grief paradigm. Grief and loss affects everyone. The most obvious source of grief is the loss of a spouse, or parent, or child, or sibling, or friend. Many other losses can have a similarly devastating effect, like divorce, or unemployment, or illness, or moving, or the empty nest. The grief that follows loss can be paralyzing and all-consuming. Grief can make people turn inward and withdraw from their communities. Grief can make it difficult to accept help, companionship, and care. Grief can make it difficult to see the world clearly and to see signs of grace. For people who love a grieving person, they may feel that their efforts of care and concern are rejected. It's not easy to care for someone when one's efforts are repeatedly spurned. Too often we try to move grieving people quickly toward healing, failing to realize that grief is a long and slow process. And grieving people sometimes feel guilty about how much they cry and how angry they are. And they wonder why. Why is it taking so long to feel normal again? Our best response is to simply acknowledge the depth of their anger and pain, because people do experience all these stages of grief in the midst of loss. Naomi thought she had lost everything, but she really had more than she realized. She had Ruth. God had not abandoned her. Grief was a long process for Naomi, but eventually, she turned a corner. And she stopped pushing Ruth away and started to appreciate her. Last night, Anthony and I went to see Catherine's play. I don't know if you didn't see it, you missed something. Boy, was she good. She was so good. But prior to that, we decided that we would have dinner. And so we went to a restaurant, and on the way out of the restaurant, there was a man who was coming in, and he was holding the door. He was holding the door for us. And he told me, he said, take your time, because I was struggling to walk because my knee is giving me a lot of problems. But when he said that, his words really touched me. And so there were two doors, right? So he went back out to open the second door for me, and I purposely moved away. I was looking at the Christmas tree, because I didn't want him to wait, because I was moving so slowly. You know, when your body starts doing weird things and you can't function like you used to, you know, you start to feel vulnerable, right? My husband is like, you need a cane. I'm like, absolutely not. I cannot be ready for a cane. But not being able to walk at my usual pace, it did something to me. And he said, take your time. And he meant it. He meant it. And I think these are also words that bring healing to a grieving person. Grieving people they just need time. The other thing that happened is, so the three of us were walking back to our cars, but the man, you know, he still was holding the door for this other young family that was coming into the restaurant. And a little boy, probably about 10, he turned to the man and he said, thank you very much. And that meant the world to the man, right? And he said to us, he's like, this is what the world needs, right? Just these simple little gestures of gratitude and thanksgiving and patience. You just never know what people are going through. And in the face of devastating loss, when it appeared that all was gone, it was difficult for Naomi to see what and who was left. She had Ruth, right? Ruth was right in front of her. So I wonder, who do you have? Who do you have that's maybe right in front of you that you're not seeing? Ruth is the image of God in this story. She shows hesed. That's the Hebrew word for steadfast love. She shows that to Naomi even when Naomi resists, right? And that's the thing about grieving people, right? They're going to resist, right? They're going to be just leave me alone. I just don't want to be bothered. I don't want to talk to anybody. But relationships can be a powerful source of healing and connection and hope. Like Naomi, we are all in need of redemption and grace and healing and compassion. And God provides us with the persistent presence of Ruth so that we all can learn to receive that. For those of us who are givers, we struggle to receive this sort of love and compassion from others. And so this story is also a powerful example of a contradiction in the Bible. Israelites were not supposed to marry dangerous Moabite women, but here was a Moabite woman who acted as graciously as God did. The Old Testament often characterized strangers as dangerous and threatening. But this was not that, right? In the future, strangers and refugees will be welcomed into the Israelite community. In fact, into the United States of America. The refugee will give life, not only to the king, but also to the Messiah. The refugee, the Moabite, the Canaanite, these are all the women that we find in the genealogy of Jesus. The least likely. The book ends with a reference to Ruth being the great-grandmother of David. Despite cultural and religious norms, Naomi and Ruth embraced each other. They made room for one another in their hearts. Ruth and Naomi, Naomi and Ruth, theirs is a message the world needs to hear today. Amen? Amen.